Before we hop into how an ego is blasphemous, let's go over the definition of blasphemy. Blasphemy seems to have two different levels to it, you could say. The first one is just any sort of utterance or action against God that belittles or disgraces God in any way. And then you could say there's a higher tier up than that, which you could consider the epitome of blasphemy. And that is when a mortal individual, a person, an ego, believes themselves to be God or equivalent to God in some form or fashion. I'd like to bring in a couple very simple props to iterate the definition of blasphemy. Let's assume that this yellow piece of paper is infinite totality. That means it's borderless. That means it's unborn. That means that it's unbound. It never came into existence. It is existence itself. That makes it eternal. There is not a second to this yellow piece of paper, right? Because if there was, that would create duality. But infinite totality is non-duality. It's unbroken and whole. And therefore, it is Advaita. Advaita is one without a second. And what are the religious names that we put on one without a second? God, Brahman, Allah, Buddha, and there are a few others. But the moment something separates itself from infinite totality, which we could say is the ego, the finite ego, the moment the ego thinks that it is its own standalone entity, its own independent existence that exists separate from every other object that it knows, it changes the definition of infinite totality. Because now there's two. Now we have duality. We've got a finite entity known as an ego, and then we have another finite entity. By the ego believing that it is separate from the whole of totality, it crushes the definition of infinite into finite, because now there's two. When we talk about finite, there is only one infinite. Whatever that infinite is, and we know what that is here in Advaita, it is awareness. It crushes the infiniteness of the infinite into a finite entity. So it crushes God down into a limited, finite form, because now there's two. So an ego unknowingly is equivalent or equal to, in some form or fashion, than what was at once infinite totality, because it has separated itself from the infinite, creating a finite entity. So where there used to be just one infinite totality, now there's two finite entities, which is duality. And this is where suffering arises. And when the ego believes that it's separate from God, this is the epitome of the top tier of blasphemy. I'd like to read a couple passages out of my book, Love Outpouring, that specifically describes blasphemy to the reader. Blasphemy is when an independent mortal person, also known as a finite entity or an ego, believes itself to be separate from and therefore equal to infinite totality, in which infinite totality in religious terms is referred to as God. The ego truly thinks it exists in one place and God exists elsewhere, generally in a location an infinite distance away from its egoic, finite self. With the ego being in one place and God in another, there are now by definition two finite entities, making God limited and finite, therefore making God the same as the limited and finite ego, which is blasphemous. Self, on the other hand, only knows itself as an infinite eternal being in unity with infinite totality, oneness. Self realizes that God is sharing him, herself, through all selves. Being that there is only one infinite, undivided whole, which is totality, then logically there is only one infinite, undivided self. No self can stand apart from another self. There is only one self, including God's self. Oneness, the absence of blasphemy, is yourself being in absolute unity with the unconditional love and acceptance of God, of totality. You, ego, are not God, but you, self, are God. God shines in your heart as I am. Understanding wholeness from this perspective, you begin to know and see yourself as others, and others as yourself, in which you experience peace, happiness, and love directly, and thereby consequentially lose the ability to exploit and to manipulate. Yourself equals myself equals ourself equals himself. Therefore, any movement away from yourself is an act of blasphemy. Because the moment you move away from yourself, you have whatever it is you've moved away to, plus you have yourself. That's duality. And what creates duality? An ego creates duality. An ego believes it's moved itself away from the wholeness of itself, from the wholeness of God, and has become something other than wholeness, something other than total completion. So that's why by turning within and knowing yourself directly, you come back in line with the love of God, with the love of yourself. I'd like to finish this with a quote that is also in the book. It's a quote by Erwin Schrödinger. And Erwin Schrödinger is known as the godfather of quantum physics. So in the book, I have a whole section on science and self, where every scientist who's totally honest with themselves and follow the truth, no matter where it takes them, always leads to self, to totality. And this is found in the Upanishads, where Advaita Vedanta is located, the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta. Erwin's quote says, "From the early great Upanishads, which is the Vedic texts, the recognition of Atman, which is self, equals Brahman, which is God, was in Indian thought considered far from being blasphemous. To represent the quiescence of the deepest insight into the happenings of the world. So even Western academia says that Advaita, non-duality, is where truth is found. So when you find the truth, you remove blasphemy from your life and you come back in line with the reality of God, with the reality of yourself. And what is that? That's just being. It just is. God is not some super power that's running around the cosmos, applying his power and manipulating anything. God just is. And you are that.